Hello and welcome to the session on Francis Bacon's prose style. Francis Bacon, who was a contemporary of Shakespeare and who lived in the Elizabethan England, is known as one of the greatest masters of English prose. His contribution to English prose cannot be assessed because his prose is one of its kind. Nobody before or after him, I guess, could really write prose, English prose, like Francis Bacon did. About Francis Bacon, I should also mention that he is not just a writer, but though he is known to us as a prose writer, as the author of the very famous essays, he was also a philosopher and a scientist. In fact, he was a man who had a mind that travelled much ahead of his times, because years back, that is in the Elizabethan age, he had the foresight and the imagination and the brilliance to think about refrigeration and about flying planes. So that was the kind of man Francis Bacon was. He was born in 1561 and died in 1626. And about him, Pope, the great writer and critic, has said this. Let me borrow the words of Pope. Francis Bacon, he says, was the wisest, the brightest, the meanest of men. And again, Ben Jonson has made this observation about Francis Bacon. No man ever coughed or turned away from him without a loss. So what did he mean by that? He meant that Francis Bacon had such a brilliant mind that when you are in conversation with him, even if you turn away for a second, you would miss out on something really precious. And the critic D. Alembert has said, Bacon is the greatest, the most universal and the most eloquent of philosophers. So he undoubtedly remains the greatest of our prose writers. And before we go on to Bacon's prose style, I'll just quickly tell you about the prose or where English prose stood then, just before he started writing. The greatest prose work in English literature up to then was King Alfred's Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which of course was not written by any one author. It was a collection of entries made of the various reforms that happened in the country, the important events that happened in the country, and this work of compiling was entrusted to the various monasteries. So, though it is a significant work, King Alfred's Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, it doesn't really boast of a unique prose style. And another work of this time was, it was in Latin, but the great work by Venerable Bede, the Ecclesiastical History. And we have a book called The Rule of the Anchoresses, which is the author of this book is unknown, but this is a book of, it's a book of advice to 3 young women who wanted to enter religious life. And there were many other translations based on Italian and Latin models. Chaucer himself had translated quite a few works from Latin. And so that, and then of course I should mention the translations of the Bible. Okay, many versions of the translated versions of the Bible were also available. And so this was where prose stood then. And it was Bacon who brought a very unique style into prose writing. Now let us go on to Bacon's essays. Bacon borrowed the term essays from the French writer Michel de Montaigne, who was his contemporary. And it is said that he borrowed only the title, essays. And those days, it is said that people had this, especially men of cultured circles, the educated men, they had the habit of keeping a book called a commonplace book. It was a kind of a pocket book or a diary, you could call it, in which they would note down any important, anything that would strike them, maybe a new word, an idiom, a phrase, an event. So this was called the commonplace book, and Bacon too maintained a commonplace book, and it is believed that he got the matter for many of his essays from this commonplace book. And he was a keen observer of people and of the things around him, and he has written his essays on a variety of topics. Like, let me just tell you a few of the topics he has written on off truth. All his essays are titled like that: off truth, of marriage and single life, of love, of travel, of empire, of youth and age. And so it goes on, the list goes on. There are 58 essays in all. In 1597, the first collection of essays came out, and then there were just 10 of them. And Bacon did not anticipate the popularity of his essays, and so when in 1612, when he brought out the second edition, he made improvements and additions because he knew that people were enjoying his essays. And so with some additions and with slight modifications of the earlier 10 essays, he brought out the collection of 38 essays. And then the final version came out in 1625, that is just a year before his death, and the final version contained 58 essays. And his essays, they cover a variety of topics, as I mentioned earlier. And oftentimes when I read his essays, I feel that there is no comparison to his style of writing in English literature. But somehow I have felt that there is something similar with Bacon and the great Tamil poet Thiruvalluvar, because Thiruvalluvar's Tirukkural also, it's just 2 lines each. There is a chapter, each chapter has 10 2-lined verses or couplets, you would call them, and within that 2 lines he kind of compresses a whole world of meaning. So whenever I read Bacon, maybe it is something that only I have felt, but then that is my personal opinion on Bacon's style, I feel that there is a similarity. And again, the range of topics which these 2 men covered, so there again I have often felt a similarity, because Bacon's essays too, you can just take a sentence from his essay and you can go on talking about it, just like you can go on talking about 2 lines of Tirukkural. And okay, now coming back to the essay, and so I said that he got the name or the idea of the essays, he got it from Montaigne. But then there stops all similarity between Montaigne and Bacon, because Montaigne's essays are intensely personal. He writes about his own feelings, his own opinions, what he felt about the world around him, and often about very personal experiences. Whereas in the essays of Bacon, you will not find the man anywhere. You will not understand a thing about the man called Francis Bacon when you read his essays. He was very good at kind of concealing himself or his character from what, or keeping away his character from what he wrote. Many writers don't succeed in that matter, because you often feel that somewhere or the other the writer's character and his qualities get reflected in the writing. But in the case of Bacon, he has been able very successfully to keep himself detached from what he wrote. And that is why I guess a critic has observed that while Montaigne studies his personality in order to disclose it, Bacon wishes rather to hide his defects so as to impress people favorably and achieve success. So that is what is different about Bacon's essay in comparison to Montaigne. And again, Montaigne of course writes with an introduction, with a kind of a preface, but then Bacon just delves into the topic. He goes into the topic without much preamble. He doesn't bother about giving an introduction or telling us what he's going to talk about. He straight away jumps into whatever he wants to talk about. Now let me enumerate the characteristic features of Bacon's prose style. It is said that Bacon adopted a style which may be described as one of the longest steps in the evolution of English prose. As I mentioned earlier, when I was talking about the writers before him, I had made this point that with his essays, he took the English prose so far ahead from what it had been when he started writing. And he placed it on a platform of such excellence, such inimitable excellence. And as one point I would like to repeat is that his essays don't bother with an introduction. Let me just read to you the first line of a couple of his essays. Of marriage and single life begins like this. He that hath wife and children hath given hostages to fortune, for they are impediments to great enterprises, either of virtue or mischief. So no introduction whatsoever. Now let's look at another first line, the essay called Of Great Place. Men in great place are thrice servants, servants of the sovereign of state, servants of fame, and servants of business. So this is how he begins. So that is one point to be noted about Bacon's prose style. He begins without introduction or without preamble. Then another point is that he writes in aphorisms or very short pithy sentences. And clarity of expression is yet another quality of his style. And coming back to this idea of it being in aphoristic in style, what I mean when I say that he is aphoristic is that some sentences, even his sentences can be elaborated like a proverb. A proverb or an aphorism is a saying. So his sentences can be elaborated into essays. And his English is marvelous. It is very terse in the sense it's dense, it's very precise, and it is kind of sibylline. That is a word that I found very apt to describe the work of Francis Bacon. Sibylline, 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 which means very, very cryptic, short, concise, dense. All those can be used to describe his prose style. And though it is like this, it is immensely flexible too, because it lends itself to any topic that he wanted to deal with. And so he has written about a variety of subjects in the same style. And he was a scholar. He was a scholar in Latin, and as I told you, he was a scientist and a philosopher. And all that scholarliness can be seen in the essays. He uses a lot of quotes. Most of his essays have quotations taken from Latin texts, and he uses a lot of figures of speech. He was a master of simile and metaphor. His metaphors and similes are so apt that you cannot think of anything else to express the idea. So apt they are. And so that's why it is said here, one of the critics has observed that his metaphors and similes are always apt, and they never fail to strike, to charm, or to thrill. Okay, his metaphors always strike, charm, and thrill. And the critic West says, in the history of English literature, Bacon ranks among the creators of our modern prose. His position as a classic is secure. So he is undoubtedly a master, a classic, and his work too. That is why it has endured the test of time. Even today, though students may find his style a little difficult, a little intimidating, but once you get into it, there is nothing like Bacon's essays. So I would recommend that you read more of Bacon's essays. I know that once you get into it, you would thoroughly enjoy them. And he was such a genius and at the same time a man of the world that he speaks of universal, of everything that he talks about. He has got a very personal way of looking at it. And he makes such observations which amaze you with their ingenuity and with their correctness, because you agree with every word that he says. Even after so many years, when you read it, it still holds true. So that is why we say that Bacon's essays are universal. They traverse across years and all times. They continue to remain popular mainly because they are universal, and again because they are unique. So my attempt here is to get you attracted towards Bacon's essays. As I told you, try to get over your initial the stumbling block that Bacon would pose with his complicated prose style. But once you get in, you thoroughly enjoy that. I take my word for it. So I would like to talk about a couple of his essays, which I'll be doing in the following videos. But please read Bacon. That is a very personal recommendation from me.